Mike, PwC, you do an annual study of what this is. So tell us in a nutshell what it is, how big is it?
So it covers advertising spend, consumer spend in internet, in advertising, as well as media, as well as internet access across 54 countries. We break it down across 13 segments, everything from business to business to out of home. And we try and chart how those spend profiles are going. We look 5 years forward and we look 5 years backwards. So our current outlook goes all the way through to 2020.
And it's something like, I think you say, a $1.7 trillion industry, so that's pretty big.
That is a large industry.
Grew between 5 and 6% last year. Going forward, Cecilia, what are you saying for the
going forward in our
growth?
study, our study revealed that it's a 4.4 going forward globally.
Over what period?
Over the next 5 years.
4.4 for you. So it's slowed down a little bit compared with last year, you're saying?
Yeah, it's just on the surface.
Yeah.
When we deep dive down, it's actually a lot of countries have a higher growth rate. So we actually categorize our countries into different categories, from mature to upcomer, from slow down. So we actually have 4 categories to analyze different countries. So a lot of a promising story can be dig out from our study. A lot of countries, their annual growth rate a lot higher than their GDP.
Okay, and I think that's the interest here, really to dig down and say, okay, in this overall large industry, what are the trends by geography and by demography? Perhaps we could start, rather than by geography, let's start with demography. And there's a lot of talk about young consumers sort of driving these consumption trends, but millennials, for example. But I'm sure that's true, but even that's not a simple matter. Who are the young consumers? Is it right to talk about young consumers as a group, or is it more complicated than that? So would you like to?
So we
elaborate?
actually define young population for anyone below 35. So this is how we define the younger generation. In our entertainment media outlook, we have very interesting observation. If we put the country with a bigger younger generation and then compare to their growth rate, it almost forms the perfect correlation. The more younger generation, then the higher growth rate. So take US for example. US have a relatively lower younger generation, while its growth rate is a kind of a tier. While China, we have a sort of a more younger generation, and then our growth rate is at 8.8. So Indonesia is even have a remarkable number.
Even more remarkable.
But I think we have to open up a whole other avenue that's related to it as we define, as you say, what this means. Because what we've seen is that the demographics of it are the basis. But we've recently done a study which we've defined as the velocity markets. And the reason we did that is you have to look at what that begets in social change. If you take China, for example, the explosion of media in China has been phenomenal. It's reshaped the media world, right? $500 billion in the advertising spend world of that larger pie that you're talking about. The major shift in the world in the last 10 years has been to China. But the story about China is not about spend, it's about the radical change of society. Consumer expectations, growth of a middle class. Once you have a middle class that goes from a fraction to the majority of a market, the mindset changes. So I think what's so dramatic in the reshaping of the world right now is how this spend and this rapid spend in some markets is actually causing a social velocity that starts from economic velocity. You know, these growth markets are what they used to call emerging markets, which we don't think is an adequate description. But then what it's going to mean for what people expect and what they do. And that's what then drives the second part. So for example, if you're exposed to a lot more in advertising, you're a lot more likely to want to get on an airplane and fly away, which the Chinese do now in droves, because disposable income doesn't mean I'm going to buy another refrigerator, it means, or another handbag, it means I want an experience now. So that's what I think is really fascinating about this whole discussion.
So if you get away from emerging markets, certainly BRICS seems to be a sort of yesterday's concept because it's such a varied group, but velocity markets, which are the ones that you mentioned China, but what are the other ones, what are the other parts of the world that are really changing fast, moving at velocity?
think the thing we saw is that in the future, South Asia is going to play a more dominant role. I mean, we all know that China has been an enormous global story, and we all feel it. And it's still important, but going forward, South Asia, meaning primarily India, but Pakistan, Bangladesh, some of the countries, I think it's interesting, predominantly Muslim markets, that Indonesia, Vietnam, Nigeria, Egypt, still to some degree places like Brazil and Mexico, if we talk about middle class.
Yeah.
But again, it's partly about the economics, but it's really about the social change, because when you talk about a number of markets that are majority Muslim markets, we saw in our research that 60% of the consumers say they feel that international marketers do a bad to very poor job of talking to them. So you suddenly get into a whole set of issues that's beyond just the numbers, and you start to say, are people understanding these markets? Do you know, how prepared is an international firm to do a good job in marketing in Pakistan today? That's a challenge. But if you don't recognize how fast Pakistan is moving as a market, and it is, from a qualitative point of view, you're missing out on growth and opportunity.
Yeah.
Now, Amani, perhaps picking up the Muslim market question, perhaps you could say whether does it make sense to talk about this as a global concept, or does that mask too many differences between those markets?
I think that part of the problem is the fact that things are becoming very globalized right now, in the way that we are trying to reach different audiences and different communities. I don't think that it's a coincidence that young people are driving markets, and that also young people are the ones most saturating social media. I think that growth in social media is something that has been impacting a lot of different industries. Like, for example, it has significantly impacted fashion. Hijab and modest fashion on Instagram has become like such a huge trend in a way that is amazing because of how globalized it is. You know, like hashtags are really uniting people across all different fronts. A lot of brands are recognizing this. Over the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen major fashion brands start creating lines catered towards specifically Muslim women, like hijab, abaya lines. I believe DKNY was one of the first ones. Dolce & Gabbana just this year released a new line catered towards Muslim women. But I think that there's a huge misunderstanding in which target audiences they should be reaching. Like, for example, one thing that I've noticed that I think a lot of brands are making a dire mistake about is that they assume that if it's a line that's geared towards like modesty or like Muslim women, for example, that it can only thrive in Middle Eastern or Muslim countries. Right. Meanwhile, in the United States, for example, the buying power of Muslim Americans is $140 billion. That's virtually untapped by any major brand or major industry. And these are the people that lack the resources, like lack the modest fashion that they don't have access to, that is otherwise
But is it going to be the same sort of fashion that will sell in the United States as will sell in, say, the Middle East?
Well, I mean, you can just look at all the attention that it received in the United States or even in Western countries, right? Like, all of the media attention, all of the hype was in our countries. Meanwhile, in the Middle East and in the countries where these where these new brands and lines were being catered towards, they were not succeeding. They're not doing very well right now. And I think that also has to say a lot about like the competition in those spaces and the lack of access that we have and the lack of immersion of those different brands into our different demographics. But at the same time, it's also interesting to note that if young people are driving markets, the Middle East, the majority of it is under the age of 30. Right. And entrepreneurialism is booming right now. There's a lot of like startups in the new like up and coming spaces that are taking shape over there. So it's very exciting to see what it can do to the economy.
Mike, can I pick you up on ask you to pick up on this point about young people, because it seems to me
because I'm the youngest. Or?
I'm not. Okay.
Just the idea that we lump young people as a category, so even millennials, but sometimes people say actually there's big differences between millennials and other generations, and maybe those demarcations, you say emerging markets are no longer valid. Maybe we're being too crude in our segmentation of whatever constitutes young people. How does that square with your study? Do you dig deeper into that too?
So we do try and dig deeper into some of the numbers, but what was interesting for me is just whilst you were talking, I was thinking of a perfect illustration of that, which is Indonesia, which is 60% below 35, therefore by definition young. Growing at 15% CAGR through to 2020, it's a $9 billion market from an advertiser's perspective, and yet it's only 47% penetrated from a smartphone perspective. So their dominance in social, their affinity with the mobile, their usage of those platforms will only be, probably demonstrates the perfect market, and perhaps you'll seek to open an office there in short order. But I think there's something actually very much around those connected and those unconnected, or those connecting those individuals. I read a fascinating story about even in an Indian market where someone takes a smart card and actually downloads a lot of content onto the smart card and consumes it using what we would call a feature phone. They haven't got to the point of getting smartphones just yet, despite the fact there's 260 million of them in India alone. So there's a huge growth potential. And I think one of the title points here is very much around that potential. If we can harness, or at least brands can harness, how that consumption pattern works. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. Far from it.
Actually, we are in the world of differences. Like India is a great example. China is also a great example too. China, the current mobile internet penetration is around 64%. But does that mean everybody have mobile phone or connected to internet, which is not. If we take the remote area as example, I believe a lot of our children or the younger generation, they don't even have the connectivity. So I would say like the connectivity is really important to drive the growth of the future.
I'm interested in the question of innovation that comes from the, we talk about these young consumers around the world as driving growth, but are they also driving innovation, inventing things that are not just being imported from outside, but actually developing ideas and types of consumption that didn't exist before?
I worry again, though, if we limit our view, we become a bit ageist. And there's no doubt that young consumers are driving change in the world of social media. But for example, you're talking about Indonesia. There are 15 million women that are intrapreneurs today. So they're using Instagram to run small businesses. Now, some of those women we interviewed, a number of them, they are mid-30s. They have a child at home. They maybe worked in a professional role, for whatever reason decided to exit that to start a family, but now want to be entrepreneurs. Some cases they're selling halal products, or they're selling fashion products, they're selling cosmetics. Maybe it's secondary. So first of all, I think we have to recognize that innovation is coming at other ages. So I'd hate to feel that we're excluding other age groups, and that's an important part. And I think the second part is it won't necessarily be these big multinationals that finally get it when it comes to the Muslim consumer and their opportunity. In a lot of cases, it's going to be other entrepreneurial startups who are filling that because they understand that. More local brands, more social selling from maybe smaller entrepreneurs. And they're going to force the multinationals to up their game.
Manu, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that's kind of what we've been seeing, like with what we've been doing with Muslim Girl. We've had to fill that space by creating something of our own to compete with all of these corporate media entities that otherwise were excluding our narrative. And I also think that, you made an interesting point earlier about the connection between that, that growth and social mobility as well, because I think that young people are absolutely using their consumer power to drive that type of diversification of society. I think that right now, we've seen kind of a huge shift amongst brands and the way that they advertise to young people. They've become more inclusive. They've tried to really show, for example, different body types, different races, different religions, in a way that's really trying to pull in people, not even just to be able to attract different audiences, but because I think that the values of young consumers are very strongly geared towards that direction. And it's very interesting to see really the ripple effect that that's going to cause through consumerism, through the economy, which is very fascinating.
Could we dwell on China just for a moment, because it is such a huge market, and I wonder whether China is changing tastes, changing consumptions in fundamental ways that we haven't fully appreciated outside China yet. So Cecilia, perhaps you could tell us about China.
China definitely changed a lot. As I said, China is highly mobile and also highly online. So, and also one of the unique thing is China has very predominant social media, which acting as a service integrator to draw in a lot of other services onto the social media platform. For example, WeChat launched 5 years ago. Nowadays, people basically can do everything on this is social media, from banking, from micropayment, from even transform the traditional like right envelope is changing during the Chinese New Year to some social game. So I can elaborate a little bit more. So traditionally, during the Chinese New Year, people, the senior people like us, we tend to give the right envelope to the younger generation to wish them good luck. So back in early 2015, during the Chinese New Year period, WeChat jointly with CCTV, they launched a sort of game by giving out the real electronic money to the other people through e-payment in a way of a red envelope. So people can get the red envelope based on first come, first serve, and also the amount is actually on random basis. So it becomes a social game. Now, when we have a big banquet, people tend to give out the right envelope. So there are a lot of, actually who make it fly is actually the age from 20 to 29, the highest amount of user using this app to drive this growth.
As you say, what's I think unique about China in the world is given that it's been a fairly closed market to outside competition, it's developed these three enormous platforms that are basically now the backbone for so many other things. And if you're a startup business, you've got an instant backbone because you don't have to worry about a payment system. You've got it through the platforms. You've got the ability to connect and have fulfillment through the platform. So it's actually an interesting example, and the question is whether that will be replicated quite the same way in other places in the world, because that's what's driving the velocity, is when I'm a young business and I don't have to worry about any of that, I simply have to hook onto a platform and sell, then I can do it.
So you talk about what's driving the velocity, and we've got a lot of a real sense of the deep trends that are pushing for this. What about some of the things that are holding it back, or that prevent things taking off as much as possible? So regulation, for example, the political environment in some parts of the world, some specific markets, which are clearly constraints on entertainment and media consumption. How important is that? Yeah. So what do you see as the main constraints on growth? You see that there's this, on the one hand, powerful push, things moving very fast. On the other hand, in some places more than others, obviously, growth being held back.
I think you called out all the main ones. Certainly there's a patchwork quilt of regulation across my neck of the woods in Southeast Asia. Just to illustrate with a couple of examples, if you put in an advert on TV and on free-to-air in Malaysia, you have to submit that advert 3 months in advance to go through taste and decency standards and get it censorship or get it censored. I think in a world that is going to democratize and encourage access ever more so, that will have to be subject to some change. And we've seen a couple of things. The MDA, who are the major media regulator in Singapore, have started to make overtures and issue sort of consultations with the media industry, both within Singapore, but also those that serve from outside, as to how to provide a level playing field for all parties involved.
So, Marnie, is this something that you're mindful of as you're sitting in New York, but where you have a liberal regulatory environment generally, and also great freedom of expression, but you're going out to parts of the world where that is certainly not the case? How do you handle that?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I've noticed is that there's definitely cultural restraints for a lot of young women. Like in Egypt, for example, women are getting more degrees than men now, and Egypt is one of the biggest hubs of this type of burst of entrepreneurialism right now. But there are a lot of restrictions, right, about cultural norms, what young women should be involved in, what they should not. And for us, we've been facing a lot of adversity when we are entering those spaces because.
How do you feel that? What sort of pushback do you get?
Well, there's a lot of communities in which we haven't been able to really penetrate too deeply because of a lot of the, beliefs or the values that we stand by, which might not be as, forgiving in some areas than others.
But is it just a question that they don't engage with you, or do they positively tell you that they disagree with what you're doing and that they object to what you're doing, or a bit of both?
A bit of both, yeah. But we definitely do receive people telling us very straightforwardly that it's something that they can't engage in. We've received like on visits in the Middle East, scrutiny over the work that we do. And I think that there's a lack of support. There's a lack of resources for young people that are kind of like going off of the norm or going off of the status quo from these institutions that we see overseas. And I think that really the internet and social media is kind of democratizing that right now. So it's creating this space where a lot of people are able to connect with each other across these borders. It eliminates the boundaries, and it's really, even allowing anonymity to some people. Like we saw in the Middle East that a lot of women have relied on the anonymity of social media in order for them to engage in a lot of like political discourse online that they otherwise would not really attribute their name to. So I think that it's an interesting direction, and I'm hoping that it can only become more and more accepting as time goes on.
Can I add a view to that? Because I think what's instructive for a moment, because I think we all recognize that BRIC as a term has outlived its usefulness. But BRIC, Brazil's a basket case, Russia similarly, India continuing to grow dramatically, China growing but slowing. So BRIC is diffused into a very different group. And I think you have to start by saying that good government and good government policy still matters. In an economic world, there's more and more economic velocity being created by the private sector. But if you fundamentally have bad government, corruption, taxation, poor policy, it's an extrinsic factor that slows down the intrinsic natural ability of these markets to grow. So you talked about the demographics of growth. They're all there intrinsically, but the extrinsic factors can hold it back. Otherwise, Brazil, which was such a fabulous growth market and still has a middle class and still is even one of our 12 markets, has slowed dramatically as a result. And so I think that's something we still have to recognize as a break on growth.
But isn't China a particularly interesting example of the conflicting pressures in a sense? You have all these growth forces. It is growing very powerfully as a market still, and particularly in consumer area and young people, as you say. But it is also an increasingly restrictive market in terms of the controls on the media, for example. So something that you observe, I'm sure, from Hong Kong very acutely.
Hong Kong is a quite open area.
Exactly.
So, but when we walk across the border, it's a totally different story. China, I would say, it has the growth, all the world envy. However, it always like that. Where's the money grow, and then where's the regulation goes after. So in China, it's exactly the case. Like firstly, a lot of restriction on free terrestrial TV. Even have the foreign import program, you can't really broadcast during the peak time, and subsequently followed by restriction on the amount of entertainment program you can broadcast on the free time. So that really drives the consumer to the OTT platform. OTT provide more flexible contents, and also with a lot of foreign import program which you can freely watch from there. And then the regulation follows. Back in 2014, so new regulations start to restrict the content and actually pull out some of the government considered sensitive program down from the shelf, like The Good Wife, Big Bang Theory, something like that. And then they have to censor all the program to be listed on the category. So a lot of regulations has been imposed on the media and the entertainment, particularly on the foreign investment as well.
Yeah.
So there's a very limited space foreign investment can go freely into China. Having said that, there's still a lot of room for the joint venture. Like OTT is a good example. Although government would like to have more control in terms of who they would like to be joint venture with, but still there's a room for the joint venture. Advertising is a pretty much open up area for a lot of foreign investor. And also on the another hand, government actually do a lot of good policy as well. Like they drive the network convergence. That will be key future drive for the entertainment media in the future. And also they last year back in 2015 they launched Net of Swat initiative, pull down a lot of illegal music from the streaming side. So government has actually do a lot of good thing as well.
I think what's emerging very clearly is if you step back from the sort of big numbers, overall numbers that we started with at the beginning, you dig down, you get a much more subtle, variegated picture of what's going on. And into that, if you look at what the opportunities are that you see over the next few years, what would you highlight as areas of untapped opportunity that perhaps investors or companies coming from the outside ought to be looking at and perhaps taking advantage of. So
Starts with what you said. Women are the big factor of the next decade in terms of around the world. It's amazing how much fertility rates have dropped, education rates have increased. Women in the workforce, women as entrepreneurs, as activists. I think a lot of brands still under-recognize women. Obviously, if they're female-oriented brands, that's typically their target. But general population brands still underrepresent women, and there are a number of businesses. In fact, we highlight a paint company, Asia Paints in India, which actually realized their primary buyer wasn't men, it was women. And they had to refocus their efforts to who was actually making the home decision. So I think it starts with recognizing those targets. I think progressive Muslim consumers are an enormous global force. I think there's an enormous opportunity in the obvious is the leveraging of technology, with most companies here and other places are trying to figure out, but also urbanization, which is a global force that has been for years, but in the 12 markets we looked at is actually even faster in terms of its urbanization rates. And you've got urbanization opportunities in terms of how you think about your brand, but also what we've called urban geo, which is really the growth areas now that fill in many of the areas around these large metropolitan areas.
Yep.
Delhi, for example, goes on forever these days. So new growth, what used to be farmland that becomes semi-urban, there are new opportunities to reach consumers and new types of consumers. So there's no lack of opportunity. It's really a question of how do you prioritize in a very big, fast-changing world.
But your warning was spot on though as well. It is a very diverse set of markets. I balk every time someone refers to it as Asia. That grouping just doesn't work for me anymore. Never mind that.
Well, you could just say it's sort of almost half the world, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And also the growing part of the world. So if there's a call to action that I would advise brands and companies going into that part of the world, it's very much about commitment. Understanding the sentiments very, very distinctly as to the narrative necessary, but also the norms and behaviors and approaches. This is not something that happens overnight, far from it. And actually there's a corollary to that as well, which is we all talk about the opportunities that it affords, but also we have those three platforms, Baidu, Alibaba and Tencent. They're coming outside of China now. So we dubbed them, I suppose, Silicon Dragons for want of a better word, but their migration south, particularly to Southeast Asia, is something that I think we'll look at with different eyes over the coming years.
Yeah. So they're aggressively doing that, are they? This is happening as we speak?
And it's not just those three platforms. So you end up with Wanda taking on AMC, the big entertainment, all the films, entertainment brands. You see a huge amount of large positions being made.
SoftBank too, though. I mean, India is the new place to grow with the 400 million middle class consumers that will come on stream in the next decade. You've just seen recently, of course, Amazon declare an even bigger bet, and they're already quite involved in India. But I think you're going to see a real shootout of large Korean, Chinese, Japanese, U.S. and other players, in particularly Indonesia, India, and other big markets, because that's going to be where they're going to find their next enormous shot of growth. You're not going to find it quite the same way in China in the future, so they're looking.
Cecilia, what about your bottom line for opportunities?
But I would say we have to pay attention to local content. So globalization and localization happening at the same time. A good example, you mentioned Korea. Korea used to be very unclosed market, but as far as I know, a lot of corporate, they want to go into Korean market. Video game is a good example. They start to translate a lot of game into local language. So local content is definitely something you can't miss.
Your thoughts on Amani on?
I really would reiterate that not tapping into the Muslim demographic is really just leaving money on the table. And especially with today's very politicized climate around Muslims around the world, I think that it goes both ways, right? I think that the first industry that's able to cash in on it will be able to reap a lot of benefits. But at the same time, I think that the flip side of it is it will also translate into really amazing, impactful social change. It could really just shift the way societies are today in a way that I think will allow these types of companies to really just take the lead in creating that change. And also, I would advise that when as that does happen, that different industries pay attention to who they're pulling into the process. You know, like instead of just trying to cater towards a demographic, actually include members of that demographic in the process. You know, instead of just like creating a product that you're trying to sell to them, actually like use people from that country or whoever to like be the ones creating that product, because that's really how you can revitalize the economy as a whole.
Do you see examples of that happening in a smart way already, or is it
No.
still? You don't. So that's
I do not. That's why I'm saying so. I think that, you know, while a lot of different markets are seeing the promise in tapping into the Muslim demographic, it's almost translating in a way where they're trying to profit off of it, rather than really just engaging the community and pulling them into the process and really uplifting them as well and giving them a platform.
Okay, well, I think that sums it up pretty well. I think the general sense is of enormous opportunity, but also not easy, and a need to really understand the markets in a profound way. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank
Thank
you. Thank you.